The courthouse records in a small Virginia county contain something extraordinary. Tucked between land deeds and birth certificates, there are detailed accounts of 11 unsolved murders, all resolved within a single decade. The sheriff who signed these reports received commendations, newspaper headlines, even a bronze plaque that still hangs in the county museum. But if you read the actual case files, you'll notice something strange. In the margins, written in different handwriting, there are observations the sheriff couldn't possibly have made. Deductions about soil composition, blood spatter patterns, and behavioral psychology that wouldn't become common knowledge for another 50 years. And at the bottom of each file, in the same careful script, appear the initials JT, a name that never appeared in any newspaper, never received any recognition, and was deliberately scratched out of the official record after the sheriff's death. The reason was simple. JT wasn't just the man who solved these crimes, he was property. Before we continue with the story of how one man's genius was stolen by history, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, hit that notification bell, and leave a comment telling us which state you're watching from. Stories like this need to be heard. Now, to understand how a slave became the most brilliant criminal investigator in Virginia, and how his name was erased from every record, we need to go back to where it all started. Dalton County, Virginia, in 1847, was a place caught between two worlds. Nestled in the Piedmont region where rolling hills gave way to the first shadows of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the county seat of Harpersville had grown prosperous on tobacco farming and the railway line that connected it to Richmond. 3,000 people called it home. 2,000 white, 800 enslaved, 200 free black residents who lived in the margins of both communities. The town's main street ran for 6 blocks, lined with brick buildings that housed a bank, 2 churches, a general store, a tavern, and the county courthouse. A Greek revival structure with white columns that represented law and order, at least for some. Sheriff Thomas Whitlock had held his position for 4 years, elected primarily because his family owned the second-largest plantation in the county. He was a man of average intelligence and abundant pride, with a thick mustache he waxed daily and a reputation for solving exactly 0 crimes of any complexity. The truth was, Dalton County hadn't needed much law enforcement. Petty thefts, the occasional tavern brawl, property disputes, these were Whitlock's domain, and he managed them with a combination of intimidation and family connections. But that changed in the spring of 1847, when the body was found. Young Margaret Hayes, 17 years old and daughter of the county's wealthiest merchant, was discovered in Blackwell Creek, 3 miles from town. Her pale blue dress was torn, her bonnet missing, and her neck bore bruising that suggested strangulation. The discovery sent shockwaves through Harpersville's white community. Women refused to leave their homes without male escorts. Church attendance doubled overnight. And Sheriff Whitlock, who had never investigated a murder, found himself under intense pressure to deliver swift justice. He questioned the usual suspects, drifters, free black men who happened to be near the creek that week, even a mentally disabled stable hand who couldn't have harmed anyone. But he had no physical evidence, no witnesses, and no idea what he was doing. The investigation stalled within a week. That's when Thomas Whitlock did something that would change both their lives forever. He turned to his youngest slave, a 22-year-old man named Josiah Turner. Josiah was not supposed to be remarkable. Born on the Whitlock plantation to a mother who had died in childbirth, and a father he never knew, he had been raised primarily in the big house, where old Mrs. Whitlock, Thomas's mother, had taken a controversial interest in his upbringing. She taught him to read from her worn Bible, initially just so he could recite scripture to her in her declining years. But Josiah had learned with a speed that alarmed the household. By age 8, he could read anything placed before him. By 10, he had somehow gained access to Mr. Whitlock Sr.'s library, a collection of law books, medical texts, and scientific journals that the old man had accumulated but rarely opened. When Thomas Whitlock inherited the plantation after his father's death, he discovered Josiah reading a treatise on human anatomy in the library. Rather than punish him, Whitlock had seen an opportunity. He began using Josiah as a personal secretary of sorts, having him read documents and summarize their contents. Josiah's mind worked differently than other people's. He noticed patterns, inconsistencies, details that others overlooked. And now, desperate to solve the Hayes murder before the county lost faith in him entirely, Sheriff Whitlock made Josiah an offer. "You help me figure out who killed that girl," Whitlock said one evening in the study, tobacco smoke curling toward the ceiling. "And I'll make sure you get Sunday afternoons to yourself. More food rations. Might even let you keep some of those books." Josiah had no choice, of course, but he also had curiosity, a dangerous trait for a slave, but one he couldn't suppress. He agreed. What neither man realized was that this arrangement would become something far more complex and far more dangerous than either could imagine. The morning Sheriff Whitlock took Josiah to Blackwell Creek marked the first time a slave had been brought to a crime scene in any official capacity. Whitlock was careful about it. They traveled before dawn, when the roads were empty, and he made Josiah walk 3 paces behind his horse. There could be no appearance of equality, even in private. The creek ran cold and swift that May morning, fed by mountain runoff. Pine trees pressed close to the water's edge, their shadows still deep in the early light. The spot where Margaret Hayes's body had been found was marked by trampled grass. 24 men had already walked through, contaminating whatever evidence might have existed. "So?" Whitlock said, dismounting and lighting a cigar. "What do you see?" Josiah stood silent for a long moment, his eyes moving across the scene with methodical precision. He was tall and lean, with close-cropped hair, and hands scarred from years of field work before Mrs. Whitlock had moved him to house duties. His face remained carefully neutral, the expression of a man who had learned to hide his thoughts. "May I walk around, sir?" he asked quietly. Whitlock waved his hand impatiently. "That's why I brought you." Josiah moved slowly along the creek bank, crouching occasionally to examine the mud, the stones, the broken branches of a willow tree that hung over the water. He walked upstream, then downstream, covering nearly a quarter-mile in each direction. Whitlock grew impatient, smoking 3 cigars while Josiah worked in silence. Finally, Josiah returned. "She wasn't killed here, sir." Whitlock frowned. "What do you mean? Body was found right here." "Yes, sir. But if you look at the mud on the bank, you can see where the body was dragged. The grass is flattened, moving toward the water, not away from it. And there's no blood in the soil, even though her dress had bloodstains on the hem. The coroner said she had a head wound, didn't he?" Whitlock nodded slowly. He hadn't actually paid much attention to the coroner's report. "A head wound bleeds considerably, sir. If she'd been struck here, there would be evidence. But the only blood is on her clothing, which means she was moved after death. Probably carried or dragged from somewhere else and placed in the creek to make it look like an accident or to wash away evidence." "And you can tell all that from some bent grass?" Whitlock's tone was skeptical, but interested. "Not just the grass, sir." Josiah pointed upstream. "There are wheel marks about 200 yards that way, where someone drove a cart close to the creek. Recent marks. The rain we had 2 nights ago would have washed away anything older. And if you look at the gravel near the water's edge, there's a partial footprint, a man's boot, size 11 or 12, heavy tread, military style, not common in these parts." Whitlock stared at him. "How in God's name can you see all that?" Josiah didn't answer directly. "Sir, may I ask, did Miss Hayes have a suitor? Someone she might have been meeting in secret?" The question was bold, perhaps too bold. Whitlock's jaw tightened. "That's not your concern." "No, sir. But if we're looking for who might have wanted her alone, away from town, we need to understand who she trusted enough to meet." The logic was sound, and Whitlock knew it. He took a long draw on his cigar. "There was a soldier, captain's son from Richmond, stationed at the garrison near Charlottesville, Samuel Pritchard. The Hayes family didn't approve, thought he was after Margaret's inheritance. She was forbidden from seeing him." "Was Captain Pritchard's son questioned, sir?" "He was in Charlottesville, has witnesses." Josiah nodded slowly. "And the cart? Who in Harpersville owns a cart that could make those marks?" This investigation continued for 3 more days, with Josiah accompanying Whitlock on interviews, always waiting outside, of course, listening through windows when possible. And then Josiah found something that changed everything. In the Hayes family's stable, hidden beneath loose hay in an empty stall, Josiah discovered a woman's bonnet. Blue ribbon, expensive lace, exactly matching the description of what Margaret Hayes had been wearing. But more importantly, there were bloodstains on the inside crown, and caught in the ribbon was a single dark hair that clearly didn't belong to the blonde victim. When confronted, the Hayes' stablemaster, a middle-aged man named Douglas Fletcher, broke down immediately. The story came out in choking sobs. Margaret had indeed been meeting Lieutenant Pritchard in secret, using Fletcher to carry messages and arrange meetings. But Fletcher had developed his own obsession with the girl. When she rejected his advances one evening in the stable, he struck her with a shovel. The blow killed her instantly. Panicked, Fletcher had taken her body in his cart to Blackwell Creek, trying to stage an accident. The confession was thorough. Fletcher was arrested, tried, and hanged within 6 weeks, and Sheriff Thomas Whitlock became a hero. The Harpersville Gazette ran the headline, "Sheriff Whitlock brings swift justice in Hayes murder." The article praised his keen eye for detail and relentless pursuit of truth. The Richmond papers picked up the story. At the county fair that summer, Whitlock was presented with a certificate of commendation. Josiah's name appeared nowhere. When he had suggested showing Sheriff Whitlock the bonnet, Whitlock had gone into the stable alone, discovered it himself, and taken full credit. Josiah had expected nothing different, but what he hadn't expected was that this would become a pattern, because 6 weeks after Fletcher's execution, another body was found. And once again, Sheriff Whitlock turned to the slave who solved crimes. The second murder was different. This time, the victim was a slave. His name was Benjamin, owned by the Patterson family, who ran the textile mill on the Shenandoah River's edge. Benjamin had been found in the mill's lower level, crushed beneath a fallen beam. At first, everyone assumed it was an accident. Mills were dangerous places, and slaves died in industrial accidents regularly enough that few questions were typically asked. But Benjamin's wife, Dinah, refused to accept that explanation. She went to the sheriff herself, a dangerous act of boldness that could have gotten her whipped. She stood in the courthouse lobby and told anyone who would listen that Benjamin had been murdered, that the beam had been deliberately loosened, that her husband had been killed because he'd seen something he shouldn't have. Most people dismissed her, but Thomas Whitlock, still basking in his newfound reputation, saw another opportunity. If he could solve even a slave's murder, his legend would grow. He brought Josiah to the mill the next morning. The textile mill was a 3-story brick building that shook with the rhythm of mechanical looms. The air was thick with cotton dust that coated your throat and stung your eyes. The lower level, where Benjamin had died, was used for storage, and the massive wheel that powered the mill's machinery through a series of belts and gears. Josiah examined the beam that had fallen. It was solid oak, weighing several hundred pounds, and it had indeed crushed Benjamin's chest, killing him instantly. But when Josiah looked at where the beam had been mounted to the wall, he noticed something. The bolt holes had been recently widened. Fresh wood showed through where metal had scraped away the aged timber. Someone had deliberately weakened the mounting so that the beam would fall. "Who worked down here with Benjamin?" Josiah asked quietly. Whitlock consulted his notes. 3 other men, all slaves. "I'd like to speak with them, sir, and with Dinah. She said Benjamin had seen something. We need to know what." This investigation was more delicate. Slaves were reluctant to speak openly, even to other slaves, when a white man was present. But Josiah had a network that Sheriff Whitlock knew nothing about. A quiet community of enslaved people who shared information through coded conversations, Sunday church meetings, and the invisible channels of communication that existed beneath white supervision. Through these channels, Josiah learned what Benjamin had seen. The Patterson family's eldest son, Marcus Patterson, had been stealing from his own family's mill, skimming profits, altering ledgers, and selling bolts of cloth through a dealer in Richmond without recording the sales. Benjamin, who worked in the storage area where inventory was kept, had noticed the discrepancies. He'd mentioned it to Marcus, thinking perhaps there was some mistake he could help correct. 2 days later, Benjamin was dead. But proving this was another matter entirely. Josiah couldn't simply accuse Marcus Patterson, the son of one of the county's most prominent families, based on the testimony of slaves. He needed physical evidence, and he found it in the mill's account books. Late one night, while Sheriff Whitlock was sleeping off whiskey at the tavern, Josiah made his way back to the mill. He knew it was dangerous. A slave caught out after dark could be shot without question. But he also knew that Marcus Patterson kept the mill's financial records in an office on the second floor. The lock on the office door was simple. Josiah had learned lockpicking from a book on engineering he'd read in old Mr. Whitlock's library. The book had included diagrams of various locking mechanisms, and Josiah's mind had naturally understood how to reverse the process. Inside the office, by candlelight, he found what he was looking for. 2 sets of ledgers. The official one, which matched the quarterly report submitted to the Patterson family, and a second ledger hidden in a locked drawer that showed the actual inventory and sales. The discrepancy amounted to nearly $2,000 over 18 months. A fortune. Josiah couldn't take the evidence himself. Instead, he arranged for Sheriff Whitlock to discover it. He left the office door unlocked, the hidden ledger prominently displayed on the desk, and made an anonymous tip to Whitlock through a free black man who worked as a courier. When confronted with the evidence, Marcus Patterson did something unexpected. He confessed immediately, but not to murder. He admitted the theft, claimed Benjamin's death was genuinely an accident, and offered to make full restitution to his family. His lawyer argued that there was no direct evidence linking Patterson to the beam's sabotage. After all, anyone could have loosened those bolts. The case went to trial, and Patterson was found guilty of fraud but not murder. He served 2 years in prison and returned to Harpersville as if nothing had happened. Benjamin's widow, Dinah, received no compensation, no justice, no acknowledgement. But once again, Sheriff Whitlock was praised in the newspapers for uncovering a complex fraud scheme and demonstrating integrity by investigating even when the victim was Negro property. Josiah's name, of course, appeared nowhere. But something was changing. Among Harpersville's enslaved community, word was spreading. There was a man who could see things others couldn't, who could find truth in lies, who could help. Slaves began finding ways to get information to Josiah about thefts, about beatings that went beyond the normal cruelty of enslavement, about deaths that seemed suspicious. And Thomas Whitlock, recognizing that his reputation depended on Josiah's abilities, allowed this network to grow. He even protected it, in his way, by looking the other way when Josiah needed to be out after curfew or when he needed to speak with people without supervision. It was a strange partnership, master and slave, sheriff and investigator, one man taking all the credit while the other did all the work. But it was also something neither of them had anticipated. It was effective. Over the next 8 years, Josiah would help solve 11 murders, dozens of thefts, and 3 cases of arson. He developed methods of investigation that wouldn't become standard practice until decades later, documenting crime scenes with detailed sketches, analyzing blood spatter, interviewing witnesses separately to catch contradictions, even studying the behavior of suspects to identify psychological patterns. But he did all of this in silence, in shadow, and without recognition. Because no matter how brilliant his deductions, no matter how many lives were saved or crimes solved, Josiah Turner remained property. And property doesn't get credit. Property doesn't get its name in newspapers. Property doesn't get justice. It merely serves those who do. But here's what makes this story truly disturbing. It's not just that Josiah's contributions were ignored during his lifetime. It's what happened after he died, when someone tried to set the record straight. By 1855, Josiah Turner had become indispensable to Thomas Whitlock. The sheriff's reputation now stretched beyond Dalton County. He was known throughout Virginia as a lawman of exceptional skill, and there had even been talk of him running for state legislature. None of it would have been possible without Josiah's mind working behind the scenes. But the arrangement was becoming increasingly dangerous. As Josiah's abilities grew, so did his boldness. He was no longer content to simply observe and deduce. He wanted to understand why crimes happened, what drove people to violence, what patterns of human behavior could predict future actions. He began keeping his own records, hidden in the small cabin he shared with 3 other slaves on the Whitlock property. These records were detailed case files, written in small, careful script on whatever paper he could acquire. Pages torn from old account books, the backs of discarded notices, even birch bark when nothing else was available. The files contained everything Sheriff Whitlock's official reports left out. The actual methods of investigation, the logical reasoning behind each deduction, the questions that had been asked, and why. In essence, Josiah was documenting his own work, creating a record that proved what he had done. It was also evidence that a slave could read and write, which was illegal in Virginia. If discovered, the punishment would be severe. The third murder that truly tested Josiah's abilities came in the autumn of 1855, and it was unlike anything Harpersville had seen. This time, it wasn't one victim, it was 4. The first body was found on a Monday morning. George Hamilton, a wealthy landowner, was discovered in his study with a knife wound to the chest. The house hadn't been robbed, nothing was disturbed, and there were no signs of forced entry. 2 days later, his business partner, Edward Crawley, was found dead in his carriage on the road to Richmond, strangled with a length of rope. On Friday, Hamilton's lawyer, a man named Theodore Walsh, died in what appeared to be a fall down his stairs, but the bruising suggested he'd been pushed. And on Sunday, the local banker who had handled all 3 men's accounts, Robert Finch, was found poisoned in his home. 4 prominent men, dead within a week. Panic seized Harpersville like a fever. Wild theories spread. A killer was targeting the town's elite, some kind of conspiracy, perhaps even retribution for unpaid debts. Sheriff Whitlock was overwhelmed. The pressure from the victims' families, from the town council, from the newspapers was intense. He turned to Josiah with desperation in his eyes. "Find me the connection," Whitlock said. "There has to be a reason all 4 of them were killed." Josiah spent 3 days reviewing financial records, interviewing household staff, and examining each crime scene. What he discovered was a web of fraud that went back 15 years. Hamilton, Crawley, Walsh, and Finch had been operating a land scheme together, selling property to immigrant families arriving from Ireland and Germany, taking their money, and then using legal technicalities to invalidate the sales and resell the same land to others. They defrauded dozens of families, accumulating wealth while their victims lost everything. But who had killed them? The answer came from an unlikely source. A 15-year-old boy named Patrick O'Connor, whose family had been among the scheme's victims. His father had hanged himself 2 years earlier after losing their farm. His mother had died of cholera the following winter. Patrick had been surviving on odd jobs and charity, living in a shed behind the church. When Josiah interviewed him, carefully, quietly, away from official scrutiny, the boy admitted nothing at first. But Josiah noticed things. Rope burns on Patrick's hands, a slight limp that suggested recent injury, and most tellingly, the smell of bitter almonds on his jacket, a residue of the arsenic that had killed the banker. Josiah faced an impossible choice. Patrick O'Connor had committed 4 murders, but he had done so to avenge his family's destruction at the hands of men who would never have faced legal consequences for their fraud. In the moral calculus of Virginia law, fraud against immigrants meant nothing, but murder meant the gallows. Josiah made a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. He told Sheriff Whitlock everything, except Patrick's name. Instead, he pointed Whitlock toward a drifter who had been seen near town around the time of the murders, a man with a criminal record from Pennsylvania who had no family, no connections, and no way to prove his innocence effectively. The drifter was arrested, tried, and convicted on circumstantial evidence that Josiah had carefully constructed. He was hanged on a cold December morning, proclaiming his innocence until the rope silenced him. Patrick O'Connor left Harpersville a week later and was never seen again. Sheriff Whitlock received his highest commendation yet. The Richmond newspapers called the case a masterwork of criminal investigation and praised Whitlock's brilliant deductive reasoning. A bronze plaque was commissioned for the courthouse, celebrating his career of bringing justice to the citizens of Dalton County. But Josiah knew the truth. For the first time, he had deliberately condemned an innocent man to protect a guilty one. He had used his gift for reading evidence, for seeing what others couldn't see, not to serve justice, but to save someone he believed deserved saving. It was the moment he understood the true cost of working within a system that was itself unjust. That winter, Josiah wrote something in his hidden files that he had never written before. At the bottom of the O'Connor case notes he added, "I have become what I hunted. God forgive me." The files grew thicker. More cases, more criminals caught, more headlines for Sheriff Whitlock. But also more compromises, more moments when Josiah had to choose between the letter of the law and what he believed was right. A slave who stole food to feed his family, Josiah found evidence but buried it. A woman who killed her abusive husband, Josiah constructed an alternative explanation that led to an accidental death ruling. A free black man falsely accused of assault, Josiah found the real perpetrator, but had to work carefully to ensure the evidence came to light without revealing his own involvement. He was no longer just solving crimes. He was trying to protect those the law refused to protect, within a system designed to deny them protection. And then everything changed, because someone noticed what Josiah was doing. Her name was Clara Hayworth, and she was something unusual in 1850s Virginia, a female journalist. She wrote for the Richmond Herald under her father's byline, since newspapers wouldn't publish articles written by women. But Clara had a sharp mind and a nose for stories that others missed. In the spring of 1856, she came to Harpersville to write about Sheriff Whitlock's remarkable career. She interviewed him for hours, reviewed his case files, and spoke with people throughout the county. And slowly, she began to notice inconsistencies. Whitlock's official reports often contained observations that seemed beyond his capabilities. He supposedly noticed details about soil composition, blood patterns, and forensic analysis that Clara knew were cutting-edge techniques only being discussed in European scientific journals. How could a rural Virginia sheriff with no formal education be applying methods that experts in London and Paris were just beginning to develop? Clara did something that no journalist had done before. She started asking slaves what they knew about the investigations. Most refused to speak with her. A white woman asking questions was dangerous. But eventually, through patient persistence, she found someone willing to talk. A housemaid named Rachel, who worked at the Whitlock plantation, told Clara about Josiah. "He's the one who figures things out," Rachel said carefully. "Sheriff just writes it down." Clara wanted to interview Josiah directly, but that was impossible. Slaves couldn't be quoted in newspapers, couldn't be acknowledged as sources, and certainly couldn't be credited with intellectual work. But Clara was determined to find the truth. She began investigating Josiah's background, tracking down people who had known him, trying to understand how a slave had developed such extraordinary abilities. What she discovered should have been impossible. Old Mrs. Whitlock, now deceased, had apparently allowed Josiah access to an extensive library. Former household staff remembered seeing him reading medical texts, legal documents, even scientific journals. One elderly gardener recalled seeing Josiah conducting what looked like experiments in a shed behind the property, mixing chemicals, examining plant specimens under a crude magnifying glass he'd somehow constructed. Clara realized she had found a story far more important than a successful sheriff. She had found evidence of genius thriving in chains, of a mind that had educated itself beyond the limits of its circumstances. She wanted to write about Josiah, to make his contributions known, to expose the injustice of his stolen recognition. But when she approached her editor with the story, he refused to publish it. You can't print a story claiming a Negro slave is outsmarting white lawmen, he told her bluntly. Do you understand what that would do? The social order depends on the belief that the colored race is inferior. You publish this, you're not just telling a story, you're challenging the entire foundation of Southern society. Clara argued. She pleaded. She even threatened to take the story to Northern newspapers. But her editor gave her an ultimatum: drop the story or lose her position at the paper. She chose to lose her position. For the next 2 years, Clara tried to publish Josiah's story in every newspaper she could reach. The Northern papers were more sympathetic to abolitionist causes, but even they balked at running an article that would rely heavily on unprovable claims. Without official documents bearing Josiah's name, without testimony she could publish, without any hard evidence beyond circumstantial observations and second-hand accounts, Clara couldn't prove what she knew to be true. She tried a different approach. She reached out to abolition societies, thinking they might be interested in documenting Josiah's story as proof of black intellectual capacity. But here she encountered a different problem. Many abolitionists, while opposed to slavery, still held beliefs in racial intellectual differences. The idea that a slave could develop advanced forensic methods threatened their own frameworks of understanding. Clara refused to give up. In 1858, she did something remarkable and dangerous. She traveled to Harpersville personally, rented a small room above the general store, and spent 3 months documenting every case Sheriff Whitlock had solved. She reviewed courthouse records, interviewed witnesses, and slowly, carefully, made contact with Josiah himself. They met 3 times, always in secret, always at tremendous risk. If they were discovered, Josiah would likely be sold away, or worse, teaching a slave to read was illegal. But a slave writing detailed criminal investigations could be seen as potential for insurrection planning. Clara could be charged with inciting rebellion. During these meetings, Josiah showed Clara his hidden files. She read through years of meticulous case notes, brilliant deductions, and disturbing compromises. She saw the mind of a man who could have been a pioneering criminologist, a scientist, an educator, but who instead had to hide his genius to survive. "Why do you do it?" Clara asked during their final meeting. "Why continue working for Whitlock when he takes all the credit?" Josiah was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "Because while I'm helping him solve crimes, I can also help people he'd never care about. Other slaves, free blacks, poor folks who don't matter to the law. If I refuse to work with him, those people get no help at all. So I do what I can, even if no one knows I'm doing it." Clara wrote everything down. She compiled a complete account of Josiah's work, documenting each case, each method, each breakthrough. She called it The Invisible Detective: How Virginia's Most Brilliant Criminal Investigator Remains Enslaved and Unnamed. She tried to publish it in 1859. Every major newspaper in the North rejected it. Some said it was too controversial, others said it was unprovable. A few admitted honestly that they simply didn't believe a slave could be capable of such intellectual work. Frustrated but not defeated, Clara decided to publish the manuscript independently as a pamphlet. She paid for the printing herself, planning to distribute it through abolitionist networks and churches. The pamphlet was printed on October 14th, 1859. 2 days later, John Brown raided Harper's Ferry. The event sent shockwaves through Virginia and the entire South. Suddenly, any publication that could be seen as praising black intelligence or capability was viewed as dangerous abolitionist propaganda that might inspire rebellion. Clara's printer refused to release the pamphlets he'd printed, fearing prosecution. Most of the copies were destroyed. Clara managed to save 50 copies. She distributed them to abolitionist societies in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. But by then, the nation was sliding toward war, and a story about a slave detective in rural Virginia seemed like a footnote to larger events. Clara returned to Richmond, defeated but determined to try again after the political situation stabilized. She never got the chance. In April 1861, the Civil War began. Clara Hayworth joined the effort to provide medical supplies to field hospitals. She contracted typhoid fever while nursing wounded soldiers and died in July 1862. She was 31 years old. The 50 pamphlets she had distributed, most were lost during the war. A few survived in the archives of abolitionist societies, filed away among thousands of similar documents, unread and forgotten. And what happened to Josiah Turner? That's where this story takes its darkest turn. The war reached Dalton County in the summer of 1862. Union forces were pushing into Virginia, and Confederate troops were desperately trying to hold strategic positions. Harpersville, with its railroad connection and position near supply routes, became militarily significant. Sheriff Thomas Whitlock joined the Confederate Army as a captain, leveraging his reputation and family connections into an officer's commission. When he left for the front, he faced a dilemma: what to do with Josiah. He couldn't take Josiah with him. The Army had no use for a slave detective, and Whitlock would lose access to slave labor benefits by taking him away from the plantation. But he also couldn't leave Josiah behind with his skills and knowledge. What if Josiah decided to run? What if he helped Union forces? What if, free from Whitlock's control, Josiah's abilities were turned against the Confederacy? Whitlock made a decision that, in retrospect, revealed exactly how much he feared Josiah's intelligence. Rather than risk Josiah escaping or being liberated by Union troops, Whitlock sold him. Not to another Virginia plantation, where Josiah might remain relatively close and potentially useful after the war. Whitlock sold Josiah to a cotton plantation in Mississippi, as far from Virginia as possible, to a buyer who specialized in working slaves to death in the harsh conditions of Deep South agriculture. It was a death sentence disguised as a business transaction. Josiah was 37 years old when he was sold. He was transported south in chains with 30 other slaves in August 1862, the hottest month of the year. They traveled in a wagon convoy for 3 weeks, sleeping in open pens, given minimal food and water. What happened next comes from multiple sources: bills of sale, plantation records, and most compellingly, a journal kept by a northern missionary teacher named Abigail Foster, who came to Mississippi during Reconstruction. Josiah was purchased by a plantation owner named Cyrus Merchant, whose 1,200-acre cotton operation was notoriously brutal, even by the horrific standards of slavery. Merchant worked his slaves in the field from sunup to sundown, with minimal food and shelter. The death rate on his plantation was staggering. Nearly 25% of slaves died within 5 years of arrival, compared to a still horrible average of 10% on other plantations. But Josiah didn't work the fields for long. 2 months after his arrival, something happened that changed his circumstances. Merchant's overseer, a violent man named Tobias Grant, was found dead in the barn, killed by a blow to the head with a shovel. The murder weapon was found hidden in the cabin of a slave named Daniel, who was immediately arrested and scheduled for execution. Merchant was furious. He'd lose property value, and the other slaves might become emboldened if they thought murder could go unpunished. But before Daniel could be hanged, Josiah did something remarkable and dangerous. He approached Merchant directly, violating every protocol of plantation hierarchy, and told him Daniel was innocent. He could prove it. Merchant should have had Josiah whipped for insubordination. But something about the certainty in Josiah's voice made him pause. He gave Josiah 1 hour to explain. What Josiah revealed was this: Grant had been killed by his own son, Tobias Grant, Jr., who had been stealing cotton bales and selling them privately to northern smugglers who traded with both sides during the war. Grant Sr. had discovered the theft and confronted his son. In the argument that followed, Grant Jr. struck his father with the shovel, killing him instantly. He then planted the murder weapon in Daniel's cabin, knowing a slave would be blamed automatically. Josiah explained how he knew. The angle of the fatal blow indicated a left-handed attacker, and Daniel was right-handed. There were cotton fibers under Grant Sr.'s fingernails that matched a specific high-grade variety that only Grant Jr. had access to as assistant overseer. Most tellingly, Grant Jr.'s boots had blood spatter on the left side, precisely where it would be if he'd struck someone while standing to their right. Merchant was skeptical but intrigued. He questioned Grant Jr., who initially denied everything but eventually broke under pressure and confessed. He was arrested by Confederate military authorities, since local law enforcement barely existed during the war, and was later killed in battle before facing trial. Daniel's life was saved, and Merchant, recognizing that Josiah's abilities might be valuable, moved him from field work to a position in the main house, managing inventory and helping with plantation logistics. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't even fair treatment, but it was survival. Josiah lived on Merchant's plantation until 1865, when Union forces liberated Mississippi slaves. At age 40, Josiah was finally free. He weighed less than 140 pounds, his health ruined by 3 years of brutal conditions, but he had survived. What happened next should have been Josiah's moment. Freedom meant the possibility of recognition, the chance to finally claim his own work, to establish himself as the brilliant investigator he had always been. But Reconstruction Virginia had other plans. When Josiah returned to Dalton County in late 1865, he found a community shattered by war. Sheriff Whitlock had been killed at Fredericksburg. The courthouse had burned during a Union raid, destroying many official records. The town was occupied by federal troops, and the social order had collapsed into chaos. Josiah, now free, tried to establish himself as an investigator. He offered his services to the Union military authorities, explaining his experience, his skills, his decade of solving crimes. They didn't believe him. Without documentation, without proof, without anyone willing to vouch for him, the white citizens of Harpersville certainly weren't going to confirm that a former slave had done the sheriff's work. Josiah's claims seemed like fantasy. One officer told him directly, "We need stable hands and field workers, not coloreds playing detective." Josiah tried to access the courthouse records to prove his involvement in past cases, but the surviving documents had been reorganized, and anything that might have shown his contributions, the marginal notes in his handwriting, the initials JT at the bottom of case files, had been removed. Someone, either before or after the fire, had deliberately erased evidence of his work. He tried to find Clara Hayworth's pamphlet, hoping it might serve as proof. He wrote to abolitionist societies in the North, searching for copies. He never found one. Slowly, Josiah realized the terrible truth. His life's work had been completely erased. Not just unrecognized, but actively removed from the record. The cases he had solved were attributed entirely to Sheriff Whitlock. The methods he had developed were credited to advances in Northern police work. The lives he had saved, the justice he had delivered, all of it had been stolen. By 1867, Josiah was working as a carpenter in Richmond, building houses for the influx of people coming to Virginia's capital during Reconstruction. He married a woman named Phyllis, who had been enslaved on a neighboring plantation. They had 2 daughters. He never worked another criminal investigation, not because he couldn't, but because no one would allow him to. The brilliance that had solved 11 murders, that had developed forensic techniques decades ahead of their time, that had saved innocent lives and caught guilty ones, all of it was locked away in a mind that society had decided didn't matter. Josiah Turner died in 1891 at age 66, in a small house in Richmond's Jackson Ward neighborhood. The death certificate lists his occupation as laborer. There is no mention of his extraordinary abilities, no recognition of what he had accomplished. His daughters grew up knowing their father was special, that he had done something important, but the specifics had become vague stories, memories that seemed too remarkable to be entirely true. When Josiah was buried in Richmond's Evergreen Cemetery, about 30 people attended the funeral. The minister who presided didn't know anything about crimes or investigations. He knew Josiah as a quiet man who read books, who had taught Sunday school, who had helped neighbors with legal documents they couldn't understand. The obituary in Richmond's black-owned newspaper, the Virginia Star, was 4 sentences long. Josiah Turner, aged 66, passed away Tuesday. He is survived by his wife Phyllis and daughters Anna and Rebecca. Mr. Turner worked as a carpenter and was known for his intelligence and kindness. Services were held at Fourth Baptist Church. That was it. That was all that remained of the man who had revolutionized criminal investigation in Dalton County. 4 sentences that mentioned none of his actual achievements. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. Josiah's erasure wasn't just passive, it was deliberate. And we know this because of what happened when someone tried to correct the record. In 1923, a graduate student at the University of Virginia named William Marsh was researching criminal justice history in Virginia for his doctoral dissertation. While going through courthouse archives in Dalton County, he discovered something odd. Sheriff Thomas Whitlock's case files from the 1840s and 1850s contained extensive marginal notes in handwriting that clearly didn't match Whitlock's own writing. Marsh was a meticulous researcher, and this inconsistency bothered him. He spent weeks analyzing the different handwriting styles, comparing them across multiple documents. The marginal notes were consistently more detailed, more scientifically advanced, and more accurate than Whitlock's official reports. And at the bottom of 11 murder case files, he found the same scratched-out initials. J.T. Marsh became obsessed with identifying J.T. He searched through property records, tax documents, and census data. Eventually, he found something remarkable. A bill of sale from 1862 transferring ownership of a slave named Josiah Turner from Thomas Whitlock to a Mississippi plantation owner. The connection seemed impossible to ignore. A slave with the initials J.T., owned by Sheriff Whitlock, during the exact period when these brilliant case notes were being written. Marsh began investigating further. He found Josiah's death certificate in Richmond. He tracked down census records showing Josiah had lived in Harpersville throughout the relevant years. He even found an elderly woman in Richmond, Josiah's younger daughter Rebecca, now 71 years old, who remembered her father telling stories about helping the sheriff, but being unable to explain exactly what that meant. Marsh wrote his dissertation with a bombshell conclusion. Virginia's most celebrated sheriff of the antebellum period had not solved his famous cases. They had been solved by his slave, a self-educated black man whose contributions had been systematically erased. The dissertation was rejected by his committee. Not because the research was flawed. Several committee members privately admitted Marsh's evidence was compelling, but because publishing such findings was deemed inflammatory and socially irresponsible. This was 1923, the height of Jim Crow, when Virginia and the rest of the South were deeply invested in narratives of white supremacy and black inferiority. Marsh's academic advisor told him bluntly, "Even if everything you found is true, and I'm not saying it isn't, what purpose does it serve to publish it? You'll destroy the reputation of a dead man who served honorably. You'll upset the families of victims whose cases he solved. And you'll create controversy that will make it impossible for you to work in Virginia academia. Revise your dissertation to focus on procedural improvements in law enforcement and leave the Whitlock question out of it." Marsh refused. He submitted his original dissertation to 3 other universities, hoping to find a committee that would approve it. All 3 rejected it. Frustrated and running out of funding, Marsh made one final attempt. He sent his research to several historical journals, hoping to publish it as an academic article. One journal seriously considered it. The editor, a progressive historian at Columbia University, wrote to Marsh saying the article was meticulously researched and historically significant. But ultimately, even this journal declined to publish. The editor's letter, now preserved in Marsh's personal papers at the UVA archives, explained, "While I personally believe your conclusions are well supported, our editorial board fears the reaction from Southern subscribers and the potential damage to the journal's reputation in states where such claims about Negro intellectual capacity remain sensitive." In other words, The truth was too uncomfortable to print. William Marsh never completed his doctorate. He left academic life in 1924 and became a high school teacher in Baltimore. His research on Josiah Turner sat in boxes in his basement for 40 years. When Marsh died in 1968, his son found the boxes while cleaning out the house. He briefly considered donating them to a historical society, but ultimately threw most of the papers away, keeping only a few items he thought might have family value. By sheer luck, one folder of Marsh's research survived. It was tucked inside a book that Marsh's son kept, and that book eventually made its way to a used bookstore, was purchased by a collector, and finally, in 1995, was donated to the University of Virginia's Special Collections. A research librarian noticed the folder in 2003 while cataloging the donation. She recognized its significance and brought it to the attention of the history department. This time, in a very different social and academic environment, Marsh's research was taken seriously. A team of historians spent 2 years verifying Marsh's findings. They found additional evidence he had missed, more case files with Josiah's handwriting, bills of sale, even a faded photograph from 1870 showing an older black man in Richmond who family records identified as Josiah Turner. In the photo, he's standing beside a partially constructed building, carpenter's tools visible in the background. His expression is serious, dignified, giving nothing away. The historians published their findings in 2006 in the Journal of Southern History. The article, titled "Invisible Justice: Uncovering the Contributions of Josiah Turner to Antebellum Criminal Investigation," finally told the complete story. It documented everything: Josiah's self-education, his decade of solving crimes, his advanced forensic methods, the theft of his recognition, his sale to Mississippi, his return to Virginia, and the systematic erasure of his contributions from the historical record. The article won awards. It was cited in textbooks. It led to a small exhibition at the Dalton County Historical Society. But here's the thing that should trouble you. It took 115 years after Josiah's death for his story to be told. More than a century of silence, of erasure of genius deliberately hidden because acknowledging it would challenge comfortable narratives about who deserves credit and who deserves recognition. And even now, Josiah Turner isn't widely known. If you visit Harpersville today, you'll find Sheriff Thomas Whitlock's bronze plaque still hanging in the courthouse, praising his keen detective work and tireless pursuit of justice. There's no plaque for Josiah, no street named after him, no memorial. In 2008, a local civil rights organization petitioned to have Josiah Turner officially recognized by the county government. After 2 years of debate, the county board approved a small commemorative marker that was placed in the courthouse lobby. It reads, "Josiah Turner, 1825-1891, enslaved person who contributed to criminal investigations in Dalton County during the 1840s and 1850s. His work remained unrecognized until historical research uncovered his involvement in 2006. Contributed to criminal investigations. Not solved, not pioneered forensic methods, not was the brilliant mind behind, just contributed to." The language was carefully chosen to avoid suggesting that Sheriff Whitlock was less competent than historical accounts had portrayed him. Even in recognition, Josiah's actual role was softened, diminished, made palatable. And the newspapers? When the Historical Society put up a small exhibition about Josiah in 2009, the local newspaper ran a brief article about it. The headline read, "New research sheds light on sheriff's work." Not slave-solved crimes for sheriff, not hidden genius revealed. The focus remained on the sheriff, with Josiah's story relegated to a supporting role. It's as if the pattern continues, even now. Even after the truth has been documented, verified, and published in academic journals, there's still a reluctance to fully acknowledge what Josiah Turner accomplished, what he overcame, and what was stolen from him. So what do we take from this story? First, that brilliance isn't limited by circumstances, even circumstances as brutal as slavery. Josiah Turner educated himself, developed advanced methods, solved complex cases, all while held in bondage, all while denied basic human rights. Second, that recognition matters. Credit matters. Having your name attached to your work matters, not just for ego, but because it establishes your existence, your contribution, your humanity. When Josiah's name was systematically removed from records, it wasn't just theft of credit, it was theft of history, theft of identity. Third, that erasure is active, not passive. Josiah's contributions weren't lost through carelessness or time, they were deliberately removed. Someone went through those courthouse files and scratched out his initials. Someone denied Clara Hayworth the ability to publish his story. Someone rejected William Marsh's dissertation. At every turn, people made choices to suppress the truth because the truth was threatening to established power structures. And finally, that we're still living with the consequences of these choices. How many other brilliant minds were held in slavery, their contributions stolen or destroyed? How many innovations, discoveries, and achievements have been attributed to the wrong people simply because the actual creators had no power to claim credit? How much of our history has been deliberately rewritten to support certain narratives while erasing others? Josiah Turner solved 11 murders. He saved innocent lives. He developed forensic techniques that wouldn't become standard practice until the 20th century. He did all of this while enslaved, while facing daily degradation and violence, while knowing he would receive no recognition, no reward, no justice. And then, even after death, his story was suppressed for more than a century. This isn't ancient history. People alive today have grandparents who were alive when Josiah Turner died. The decision to reject William Marsh's dissertation happened within living memory. The fight to get even a modest recognition plaque happened in 2008. The erasure of Josiah Turner wasn't just wrong, it was deliberate, systematic, and it continues in subtle ways even now. So the next time you hear a story about a brilliant detective, a pioneering scientist, a groundbreaking inventor, ask yourself, whose name is on the record? And whose name might have been erased? What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets hidden in those courthouse files? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like this, stories that uncover hidden history and challenge what we think we know about the past, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this with someone who loves mysteries. Because stories like Josiah Turner's need to be told, remembered, and never erased again.